Welcome back. In this session, we'll be securing an Azure Logic app using Azure AD. In our previous session, which I've added a link to in the description of this video and also above, we built, tested and deployed an Azure Logic app from scratch. This session will now focus on securing that app using Azure Active Directory. Let's firstly look at our current state. So we've built an Azure Logic app, and that app provides a tracking update API. Currently, this Logic app is being secured using a shared access key, also known as SAS. SAS keys are limited and they are part of the URL, so they're parameters as part of that URL, and they're not really meant to be shared with multiple clients or users. If an SAS key or SAS key is exposed, then a creation of a new key will be required, and that would need to be distributed to all parties using your Logic app. By doing that, it nulls the previous key, but the way these keys are working, it's the equivalent of a single user and password being shared by multiple users. So it's not really an ideal solution. Below, you'll see Postman setup for the app that we generated in the last session. Here we can see the production URL, and there are various parameters that are created as part of the Azure app in order to connect. So we've got API versions, etc. And then we've got a signature at the bottom. So all of this forms part of a sort of single or multiple use URL in order to access that Logic app. So you can basically copy that, paste it into Postman or an application and gain instant access to your Logic app. And so can all of the parties that you share that with, but they'll all be using the same key in order to connect. So in this session, we're going to look at what we can do to remove this and utilize Azure AD in order to better secure and enable access to your Azure Logic app. So let's look at what the future state as part of this demo should look like. So we've got our user, and our user, instead of interacting directly with our Logic app, will be interacting with an OAuth token endpoint. So what we want to be able to do is provide them with a secret. They can then do a token request, and on successful submission of that, they'll get a token response back. It's only at this point that the user would then interact with the Logic app, and they would interact on the standard Logic app URL that doesn't include all of the SAS elements, but they would provide the token as part of that post. The Logic app will then respond in the usual way and give them the result. And it's this sort of framework that we're going to build this solution within Azure. And we'll use Azure Active Directory in order to do this. Although we'll be adding another authentication point into the Logic app, we have to bear in mind that the SAS element still remains active. So although that's perfectly acceptable, if you're not going to ever share it, it may be that you want to ensure that no one ever connects using the SAS key. That's another point we'll be talking about as part of this demo, and we'll walk through the process to ensure that the only way someone can access the Logic app is by providing the token and having that token request and providing that as part of the post. So let's now log into Azure and go through the processes in order to set this up. Right, so we're here in Azure now. We're on our Logic app, and we can see that we've got our no authorization set up for AD at the moment. And we've got our standard logic app here, and I'll now test that in Postman so you can see it's working at the moment using a SAS key. So here on screen, we've got our SAS key settings on here. We've got the parameters here. I don't mind sharing these because I'll be tearing down this whole solution once I've published the video on YouTube. So you won't be able to access using these details, but it's just to demo how the SAS key works. So we've got a SAS key set up with the signature here, and we are going to submit a message to this endpoint. So we're doing a post. If I hit submit now, we get a response back. So we have got a 400, but that's down to the fact that we're passing a carrier that isn't set up. So if I change this to something like DHL, they've got a status 101, and we change this consignment number to DHL 12345, and then we hit send. There we go. We've got a 200, so we know it's working. It's responding. It's given us an expected response. What we want to do now is we want to now look at configuring Azure AD and then disabling the ability to use this SAS key facility. So the first step we've got to do is we need to create an app registration for what we're going to call the service app. Now the service app is about opening up the roles related to what access you want basically to the application. So we're going to go and create an app registration, a new app registration, and we're going to name this something that leads us to understand that it's the service side. So let's call this Logic App let's go Logic Service App. We'll leave this as the default, it's only the standard tenant. We're not doing a redirect. We're not using a website where we're going to redirect in order to log in. This is actually an API, so we can then hit register. So very quickly there, Azure has successfully set up this app registration. We now need to start looking at setting up some of the sort of default or required settings. So for this, as part of the request, when you're submitting that request for a token, you need to be able to provide the application ID URL. So this particular service app needs to have what is known as an app URI. So we've got application ID URI here, and we need to be able to add one. So we can click on here. This takes us to exposing the API. So we need to be able to expose that to a particular URI. And if we hit add, we'll be provided with a default URI by Azure. So we can hit save here. And if I go back to overview, we'll see now that the application ID URI is now populated. So that's now configured. Next, what we need to do is we need to set up an app role. So we're going to hit create an app role. We need to give this role a name. So for here, we can call this Logic App Service Role. It's for an application. And we need to provide a value in here. And this value is what you're basically going to see in the token. So we can call this API trigger. It's around giving access to the endpoint API for our Logic app. And then we need to put a description in here. So this role allows the carrier to send HTTP requests to the trigger. And then we can hit apply. And that then creates our app role. Then next we can go to app service manifest update. So what we need to do is we need to go into here, and this is a little bit of coding. It's not really coding as such, but you've got an access token accepted version here. Now this particular version we want to set to 2, and this is due to the token version we'll be using later on. So if you don't change this, then when you follow along with this demo, you won't get the desired effect and it won't work. So we're going to hit save on here. So what we've done now is we've set up a logic service app. We've created a role, we've exposed the API and we've given it a URI, and then we've updated the manifest so that we've got it set to version 2 of the access token version. That pretty much is the service side of the app. What we now need to then do is we need to register a client app, which will basically be able to give us the ability to create things like a secret value for the token and get that side basically set up. So we're thinking of this in terms of client server. So we've got the sort of server service in essence, and then we're going to now look at the client side. So we've now created our service API. So let's get the client API created. So we can call this Logic App Client. And in the same way, we're not worried about a redirect URI, and then we can hit register. So that's created our Logic App client registration. We now need to walk through this in order to create things like a client secret. So if we go down, we've got certificates and secrets. We need to create a new client secret. Up the top here, we need to give it a description. So we could just call this Logic App Secret. And then here you've got an option to set when the secret will expire. So we'll just leave that as a default and hit add. At this point, we've got a Logic App Secret ID and a value. So after a period of time, this value will become sort of blurred out. You won't have full access to that value. So you need to copy that and you need to place that somewhere so that you're able to provide it or reference it later on. If you lose that value, then what you'll end up having to do is recreating a new secret. I'll also log the secret ID as well, so we've got that for reference. So let's go back to overview. Something to be aware of as well, and we will talk about it later on, is we will need the tenant ID, and that is used as part of the call in order to request the token. So you need to store what is called the client tenant ID, and as well as that, the client application ID is another element that you need to be able to reference later as well. Okay, something I missed off before, if I go back to app registrations and we go all applications, we can now see both of the client and the service app. So if we go into the service app, one thing we do need to note and take a copy of is the application ID URI for the Logic App service. So the app registration that we've created that for, we need to store that URI as well, because that will also be part of the later request. So I've put that in there and made a note of that. So let's go back to our app registrations and look at the client. So at this point, we now need to give our client access to the service API. And to do that, we need to go to API permissions. We then need to be able to hit add a permission. And then we can look under APIs my organization uses, and we can find our Logic Service app. So if we select that, it will then show us the various permissions. And remember earlier, when we created our sort of roles under the service app, we created one called API Trigger. So that's where this name is. Obviously, if you were offering creation, deletion, etc., you can then add those as separate roles, but this is just going to be an API trigger. So we can tick that, and we can then hit add permissions. At this point, we've got the permission added, but it's not granted as default for this tenant. So what we need to do is we need to grant that access. So what we need to do is we need to grant consent for the default directory, hit yes, and that completes that process. So we have now given the client Logic App registration access to the service app. So now we've got our app permissions set up. What I want to do is have a quick review on what we've set up as app registrations and what information, IDs, secrets, etc. we need on hand in order to now configure the Logic App security policy. So if we go into the client ID, what we need from the client ID is we need to store the application client ID. We also need to store the tenant ID. And then from here, we also will need the secret, which we stored earlier, and potentially the secret ID. So those are the elements that we'll need in order to set up the policy within the Logic App, or potentially request a token. So we just want to make sure we've got those on hand. So that's our client app. On our service app, we want to store the application ID URI, and then potentially the application client ID. Now you'll notice these technically at the moment are the same value. They could be different if you were to set up a separate application or a different application ID URI, but these are pretty much the same, except for this is got API :/ in front of it. So now we've got those noted, we can then go to our Logic App and start configuring that to use this service. So let's do that now. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to go down to authorization. We have on here Azure Active Directory authorization policies. We want to add a new policy. We need to give the policy a name. So we can just call this token policy, for instance. We might want to come up with a better name, but that'll do for the moment. And for this policy, we need to, it's Azure Active Directory, so it still stays as AAD. And then we have to have an issuer and the value for that, and also an audience and the claim value for that. So let's firstly look at the issuer. So the issuer for this will be logon.microsoft.online.com/tenant-id/v2.0. So if I put that on here, we can see we've got HTTPS login.microsoftonline.com/ and then you'll put your tenant ID here. So I'll delete this for the minute. And then it's v2.0. And the reason it's v2.0 is the same reason that when we set up the service app, we had to change the manifest detail in order to tell it we're using the newer version of the sort of token schema. So here we need our tenant ID. So we'd already stored that, our client tenant ID from our client app. So we can take that and we can drop that in here. So that's our URI for the issuer, or the claims value for the issuer. The next value is the audience, and the audience there is the client ID of the service app. So I'm going to grab that and put that on here as well. And what I'll do is I'll quickly pull on screen and show you what we're doing here. So we've got the values I discussed earlier about storing. So we've got our application client ID, our client tenant ID, the secret value and ID. Generally speaking, we're only really going to be concerned with the value. We've then got our API ID URI and then the service client ID. And then hit save. Okay, So we've now got this set up, and we can now look to start testing this policy in order to request a token and see that that works. So when you're requesting a token, it's not even hitting the Logic app, it's hitting our service that we've set up with regards to getting the token. So it's all around sort of the client app there, and then you're going to be requesting, doing the standard request to the Azure Logic app with the token that you've been provided from the service. Let's open up Postman and let's start to configure that in order for us to be able to request and see if we can receive a token. As per previous examples, we're going to use Postman for testing. So here we're going to create a new request. I've called it token just on here, and it's a get request, and the get request is to this URI here. So it's logon.microsoftonline.com/your tenant ID /OAuth2/token. And when you submit that, you're doing that as a form URL encoded request, and you're providing these 4 pairs. So grant type, which is defaulted to client_credentials. You then provide a client ID, a client secret, and a resource. The client ID is the application ID related to the client app that we created. Client secret is the value of the secret. And then the application ID service is the resource, and that resource will be the API URI that was set up under the service app. So there's nothing special I've got on screen here other than the fact that I've created a couple of variables here, and then I've got an environment I've set up where I can set those variables. So you can literally just put the text in here and not have the variables. I've done this just to make it a little bit easier to see and understand. So I'm now going to go to my Azure demo environment in order to set the variables that this GET request is going to use. So first we've got to put our tenant ID, and I'm going to pull the text file up on screen, make that a little bit smaller. So firstly, we need to put the tenant ID up there. So the tenant ID is available in the client app or the server app, but it should be the client tenant ID. In our case, they're going to be the same, but we're going to put that in there. So there we go. Secondly, we've got the application ID for the client. Again, that's here. We then have the client secret. So when we're talking client secret, we're talking about the value, not the GUID ID. And then we've got the application service ID, which is this one here, which will start API. So what this is passing through then, if we look at the token, is we're going to be passing through the tenant ID as part of the URL. So it knows what tenancy we're talking about. We're then going to be passing through the client ID. So this is the client app, the secret ID. So with those, you can then go, well, I know who you are. And then the end resource that you want the token for is then here. So that's the application service ID, which is actually called the resource in this request. Now let's try hitting send, and hopefully, doing this live, hopefully we should get a valid response. Okay, so we've got an unauthorized tenant here. So let's go back on here. Okay, so the fact that we've got a 404 error here, not found, must be something to do with the tenant ID, because otherwise we'd get a better, more illegible response. So let's go to the Azure demo settings and have a look. Okay, I've made a mistake. We've got initial value and current value. So if we set these so that we've got current values set. I bet that's my mistake here. And then hit save. If we go back to get token and then hit send, there we go. So here we've got a successful token. So the value here is the token value that we need to provide in order to make a request to our Azure Logic app. Before we go on to how we would make that request, because again, this is just around getting a token, I'd like to take this token and put it through a transformation and show you the values that are stored within that token. So here we've got a website, jwt.ms, which enables us to unpack our token. So we've got our token here that we can unpack, and here we can see some further details. So we can see our issuer. We can then also see things like our roles, and later on I'll be showing you how we can basically enable the passing through of this particular token decoded into our Logic app, because we may want to further down the line check things like roles and some of the other attributes of this. But I just wanted to show you here that obviously what we're looking at here is a decoded version of the token request or response coming back. Okay, so now let's look at taking this token and passing it as part of the request to our Logic app. So as well as our token, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to copy our workflow URL for our Logic app. So now we've copied that, we can then go into our Postman and start looking at what we need to do for that. So in Postman, we then want to be able to paste this URL. However, we're not interested in the signature or anything like that. So if we remove the signature and we try and submit a request via a post, let's try that now. Let's see what we get. So we've got a response saying the request must be authenticated only by shared access scheme. So we're getting a response back here going, this isn't correct. So what we want to do is if we go into authorization now, we can select bearer token. And then if we go to our get token request and copy the token, delete the default value that's in here and put in our token request, we should in theory be able to send this and get a response. There we go. So we have now got a 200 response back and a success. So what we have now just done is we've requested a token from our token endpoint. We've received that token, and now we're requesting to post to our Logic app using an authorization type of bearer token. We've given it the token, and then the actual body is the request itself here. And obviously we can change this consignment number, make that 102, hit send, and there we go. So we're getting that back. So we know this is working. So that's working as expected. So what we've done now is we've taken our Logic app, we've enabled the ability to request a token, and we've got that Azure AD function working. However, if I go back to my previous tab, and if I go onto authorization, just to show we've got no authorization set up on here, but we have got the full parameters here for the SAS key. If I go to the body and I hit send, we're still getting a 200. So right now we have enabled the SAS key and the new AD authorization using our OAuth process. That might be fine. We might never want to share this and it might just be used internally. However, being conscious security wise, we might actually want to go, well, actually, we don't want that at all. We don't want that enabled. In order to do that, there are some steps we can take to basically go into our Logic app and be able to check to see if we are being passed a bearer key, so a token. So if we look at what we've achieved so far, when we request the token and when we post to the logic app, we can have a look, but the actual token itself doesn't enter the logic app. It's all kind of up front, shielded from that logic app. So if we log in now, if I go and do a request again, so we're going to do a post using the authorization bearer token here, and I'm going to make it really obvious. We're going to call this Luke Demo 1. No, Luke Demo token. There we go. We can make that really obvious. So we're going to send that now. There we go. That's worked. What I'm going to do now is we're going to log into Azure, have a look at the logic app, have a look at the logs, identify this and see where we can capture, or if we can see this bearer token at all. And then what I'm going to do as well is I'm going to go Luke Demo SAS 1, and we'll send that as well so we can see the two different requests and if they appear differently within the Azure Logic App history. Okay, so we've got our two requests in quick succession. Let's take the first one and have a look at the payload. So what did we receive here? So if we come down, Luke Demo SAS, that's what we see. We see payload coming through here, fairly straightforward. Now let's go on to the next one. So this one should be our token. There we go. So we've got our token one, and let's have a look. And we'll see that actually in the headers, there's no token. So this is actually expected behavior. So what the app registration's done and enabling this security policy, it's not even letting any requests come through the logic app unless they are validated via the SAS key or the tokenized bearer token, so the OAuth process that we've put in place. However, if we want to ensure that you can only gain access into the app using a token, what we'll need to do is we'll need to do a couple of setting changes in the Logic App code view here to enable those headers to flow through into the Logic App, and then you can validate those within the Logic App itself. So here we'll be able to say, have you got a bearer token? If you haven't, drop out, and we can stop it at that point. So let's look at that now. So we'll go into the code view. You can only do this through the code view. And what we're looking for is we're going to look for the trigger, which is the start of the process. Let's come down here. Here we go. So we've got the trigger entity here. Under kind, we need to be able to include, there we go. So it's operation options, include authorization headers in outputs. So this then is going to enable us to allow that to come through. So if we do that now, we can then do a request, which I'll do shortly, and then we should be able to hopefully see more of that header information by changing something in the Logic app in order to gain that. So let's do that now. So if we go to overview, what we're going to do is we're going to edit our Logic app. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a new action of compose. And the inputs to this, if we show more now, we've got the headers as an option on here. So if I hit save, if we do this, we should now be able to run this and we'll see what compose now contains. So we're going to send, if I go to body, demo token, we're going to send this now. Okay, that's successful. And then we're going to go back in and have a look on our history to see what result we got. So if we go to compose, we can see that we've got authorization. So our headers.authorization contains our bearer keyword and then followed by the full token here. So what we're able to do now is we can edit this process to check that the authorization contains the word bearer. If it contains bearer, we know we're good and we can carry on through the switch and everything else. Otherwise, we can then fall over at this point here and exit out. So now we know we've got the compose, what we need to do is we need to add a new action in here for initializing a variable. And I'm going to call this token. It's a Boolean, and then we're going to add some custom logic in here. So what we want to do is we want to get the output from compose. We know that we've got a child element here of authorization. So what we want to do here then is we want to use something like starts with. So we can go where the authorization starts with bearer. And then if that is successful, so if we come out from here, just make sure that's it. So on success of the authorization being there, we can then add a parallel branch, and we want a response where it's not successful. So if that isn't there, if we haven't got the token there, this is going to fall out, and we want it to land. In fact, let's copy this action, paste this action in. We'll get rid of this one. We're going to call this action a no token response, and here we're going to go unknown token, or we could go unauthorized actually. Unauthorized access, and this is going to be a 401, as 401 is the standard response code for unauthorized. And then what we want to do is we want to tick all of these and make it so that it's unsuccessful. So if I hit save, now what should happen is we should come through here, it will get the headers, it will try and initialize the authorization header. If it hasn't got a bearer token, if there's any issue with this whatsoever, says no bearer token, this will error because it's going to go, well, there is no authorization header in there, and then it will basically hit this and give us the response. If it's successful, it will go all the way through. Now you might be asking, well, look, you haven't checked that that bearer is, that the token is valid. But what you've got to remember is all of that is done up front before we hit the app. So now we've saved this, we can open Postman and we can now do a test using the SAS token, in which case we should hopefully get a unauthorized access, and then we can do it with the valid token, in which case we should then get our logic app running as normal. So let's have a look at that now. So we've got our SAS key here. We're going to do a submission. We're going to hit send, and we get unauthorized access. And just to clear this off and make sure that we haven't got anything here, we're going to give this a test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Hit send, and we get unauthorized access. So now this SAS key is no longer working, which is brilliant. We can then go to the logic app where we're passing the token through. We can pass Luke test yes, put an exclamation mark in it, hit send, and there we go. So that is successful. So what we've actually achieved here is we've been able to create a logic app where we have just got the token authentication working, and the SAS key is now no longer going to be accepted as part of that Logic App workflow. Let's go back into Azure and just review what we've actually created in this session. So what we've done here is we've created a Logic service app. This service app has an app role, which is going to be allowing the app trigger role to be used. We've then gone in and we amended the manifest to ensure that the access token version was set to 2, because that is what we ended up configuring against our Logic app. And we also, on the overview, we set an application ID URI. Then we created our client app, and on our client app, we created what is known as a secret, and that was used in our request for the token. We also then added the permission on this client in order to give access to the API trigger. And again, we have to ensure we grant access for the directory, the default directory on there as well. Finally, if we go into our Logic app, we added the authorization on here for our token policy with an issuer, which is our Microsoft on, using the tenant ID there and ensuring we're using version 2, which is what we set against our service app. And then the audience here is our service app ID. So it's the client ID of the service app. Lastly, we went into our Logic app code view, where we found the trigger, the HTTP trigger, and we ensured on the trigger that we included the operation options for including authorization headers in outputs. And by adding that in, we were actually able to gain access to the token within the Logic app and add this compose in order to gain the headers, and then the initialize variable in order to validate and check for the bearer token. When I say validate, we are really just checking for the presence of a bearer token, because the authorization is all done up front. So that's it for this particular session. Hopefully this has been really useful in order to enable Azure AD on your Logic app. Now, if you wanted to look deeper into the headers and have a further review of what is going on when you're submitting a header, so if we go into the compose, if you wanted to break down this particular bearer token and gain access to the contents within it, obviously we were just checking for this to be bearer, but if you wanted to check the roles and things like that, there's a really good resource online in order to do so. So if you're interested in understanding how to break down that token value further, there is a blog by Jan that basically shows you how you can break down the various properties of the header and the token key in order to gain access to the elements within that particular token key. If you wanted to have a look at how he's done that and how you would then break that down further within the app, instead of just checking for the bearer, if you wanted to look for the roles, etc., then within the YouTube description for this video, I'll put this link to the blog on there as well. Thank you for joining me on this session. Hopefully this has been a useful insight into Azure AD and how to use it on your Logic apps. I'll look to add in the references used within this demo for things like the authentication URL, but also the article at the end covered via Jan, which goes over how to use and protect your Logic apps using Azure AD. That article is really useful as we used it in the last part of the exercise with regards to checking within the Azure app the headers and whether you actually had a token as part of the request in order to disable the SAS key element of the Azure app. Thank you again for your time. See you soon.